Jeff, you want to open it up to questions?
Yeah, so to the student teams, what questions do you have? I'm sure you have a bunch.
No, so until a few years ago, electricity was, you couldn't depend that you will get 24/7 electricity. So even as a residential housing, people would have backup generators, and very often you would have what I think it's a very Indian term to use, load shedding. So when you don't have enough electricity to supply to a population, you cut down on electricity for a certain number of hours in different localities so that you're able to spread it evenly. So a lot of people used generators as backup for when they did not have electricity. Now, at least in the Delhi area, there is constant electricity, and whenever there is no electricity, you know it's because there's been a breakdown, and this is not the normal load shedding as the government used to call it. But however, in areas that are adjoining Delhi, which is known as the National Capital Region, because Delhi has now expanded to many other adjoining states. So you have Gurgaon, which is sort of the Silicon Valley of the north, and you have all these, really fancy buildings, chrome and glass. Very often they will not have electricity, so they will have backup generators. And yes, the informal sector depends a lot on diesel generators even now, because sometimes they're not registered, they're under the radar of the government when it comes to getting an actual real their own electricity electric meter. So they will use, sometimes they will steal electricity from the main lines through wires, and other times they'll just depend on diesel generators. This is becoming less, I have to say, and there are now gas powered generators. And but again, gas is also a fossil fuel, and the end game is to stop depending on fossil fuel. I hope that answers your question. So it's a bit of both. Also, India has huge T&D losses, transmission and distribution losses. So even if generation is enough, by the time that electricity reaches wherever it's supposed to reach, sometimes in the past, I remember as a journalist with the Economic Times, when I used to cover electricity, there used to be T&D losses of almost 30%, and that used to be huge. I believe they have brought it down significantly, and as technology improves, all this is also improving. But the problem of the informal sector does remain, because and again, because it is not regulated and it is informal, even the pollution that they're generating is sometimes you're not able to measure it. You're sort of under reporting it because it's not in the it's not on your radar. So it's a bit of both again. And again, it depends on which. India is huge. It's not just huge in terms of physical space. It's also huge in terms of diversity. So what I'm saying might work for Delhi and Mumbai, and the urban areas is different from the rural areas. There are still villages in India which have no electricity. There was a village that was talked of last week. I read in the newspapers that for the first time they had electricity, and the students in a school were thrilled that they would have fans running. So you can't homogenize India. There is what we call in India, there is India and there is Bharat, which is sort of more rural Hindi speaking India. And then there is the urbanized India, which is very progressive and has, metros and railways and public transport and all of that. So India is huge, it's very different. So it would be hard to homogenize it. So what it would hold, what I'm saying, that happened in Delhi and neighboring areas 10 years ago or 20 years ago when I was covering electricity, is probably still happening in some other rural part of India, but it has changed in Delhi. It's become very different. So private households in Delhi no longer need to buy their own generators. What happens is there are a lot of condominiums. There are these super fancy housing societies. Most of them are in the neighboring areas of Delhi, because Delhi now has enough electricity. In fact, I think it can even export some electricity from what I last read. So the neighboring areas, which would be again these fancy areas of Gurgaon, which have all the head, which have all the offices of the, let's say the, all the multinationals, the Facebooks, whatever. If you drive through Gurgaon and you see these, in the middle of all the rural areas, you cross Delhi, you see all these tiny villages, cows roaming on the street, etc. And then you come to Gurgaon, which is these gleaming towers. It almost feels like you're in some dystopian. It's fabulous. But those places cannot depend on 24/7 power, so they will have backup generators. Those are the areas, both residential condominiums as well as official areas which host, like IKEA has a really fancy new office in Gurgaon. In fact, Renew Power, which is one of the large renewable power companies, which has just gone, I think they're planning to go IPO with a SPAC thing. I read about it in the papers again a couple of weeks ago. They also have their offices in Gurgaon, which are probably being used. I mean, there's probably a backup generator right there at the bottom in the basement of that place, backing up that power, because you can't depend on it.
You can go either route. The idea I would suggest to think of it this way is having a breadth component or a scalability component to your investment strategy, and then having a depth component to show that it's feasible, right? And
Right.
so you could look at either one of those scenarios. I'm trying not to tell you which scenario to do because I don't want to influence it in the. When you look at
Can I
that,
just jump in here to say I love this impact challenge, and I love the fact that it is compelling engineers to think out of the box and think of the sort of financial part of it. And because it's like this company that I'm talking about, this Pune-based company. I've talked to both the two or three of the engineers there. They're really good guys, but they're so focused on the problem and the solution, they're not really able to scale it up and bring it to a level where it could actually create the real impact. It is capable of creating impact. They've won competitions, they've got, but until you don't make it financially viable and you don't wear that MBA hat, it's not going to work. So I love what you guys are doing.
Okay.
And to play off of that comment too, also is think about blended finance options so that you can have maybe a venture capital component to it that would help bring new technologies to bear into market, while having that as a component of an overall maybe blended finance strategy.
So
Okay.
here's what I think, and it takes me back to my favorite sort of my pet peeve again, which is awareness. Now, if you do not have a population that is aware of how much health harm air pollution is causing, and you don't have public outrage against it, when you have innovations like this, which are actually going to clean the air and catch emission at source, you will not get the kind of, because this may not be the most profitable venture for these guys, right? It will only become profitable, if the government mandatorily says every vehicle that was made before, I don't know, 2015 needs to, or any vehicle that is not Euro 6 compliant needs to retrofit this carbon cutter. They've called their thing a carbon cutter, their device. Okay, so now if you do that, when would a government do that? When it feels air pollution is definitely something worthy to take care of, either if it's an electoral issue, or when people like you and me are using not, I mean, we could either use our ballots or we could use our wallets. I should be willing to pay more. Again, taking a specific example, in India, you have the two major e-commerce platforms are Amazon and Flipkart. If I knew today that Flipkart is using electric vehicles to do the last mile delivery, I should be willing to pay Flipkart more for the same product that I order, and I should choose Flipkart. So I'm using my wallet here to put pressure on a company to give me what I want, which is clean air, because then they will say, okay, we're going to convert our entire delivery fleet to electric vehicles, and therefore it will cost us more. It won't, by the way, because renewable power is cheaper. So they can make more profit, and I'm willing to fund that more profit because I want my delivery made cleanly. So if that awareness existed, then any solution that aims at cleaning the air, which includes this carbon cutter that I'm talking about from this Pune-based engineer company, would actually have more importance and more attention would be given to it, more funding would be given to it, and more companies would then say, you know, we want more of these kind of solutions, not because they're more profitable necessarily, but because that is what our society needs. Then you would have CSR funding going into it. You may have government funding going into it, and definitely private sector funding. There are a lot of companies, great companies which are looking at ESG goals. You have companies that are now saying, I mean, big companies just saying we will not fund fossil fuel companies. So it's starting now. And I think the more awareness grows, not just of air pollution as an environmental problem, but of air pollution as a health problem, is when people and populations and governments will become more aware and start putting their money where their mouth is. I hope that answers your question.
Jyoti, Sam is asking, one of the
Yeah.
reasons politicians in India are not dealing with pollution properly is that there are no votes in it. I mean, people are not asking for clean air in some sense. And in Delhi or in any city, which is the agency which is in charge of controlling air pollution?
So in Delhi, sadly, now I'll have to go back to a little bit historically. So every state has a state pollution control board, and then there is a central pollution control board, the CPCB. In addition to that, 20 years ago, the Supreme Court had set up an Environmental Pollution and Control Authority, the EPCA, whose main job was to bring down air pollution in Delhi and the National Capital Region area. This was an authority, so it was mandated to, it had full powers under the Supreme Court to actually penalize polluters, take action. Unfortunately, it was not able to do its job for various reasons. One of them being that the very constitution of this authority had a lot of conflict in there. It had a bunch of members from the automobile sector, and clearly they're not going to say, okay, we make polluting cars, vehicular pollution is terrible, let's stop producing producing polluting cars. So there were a lot of members within that organization who were in direct conflict to the goals of the organization. The CPCB itself actually is in conflict with itself. It's a monitoring authority as well as a controlling authority. Now you tell me, if you put a bunch of, if you have a noisy class and you make one of those people the monitor of the class, it's not going to be in the interest of the class to say that, okay, we were making a lot of noise, please punish us. They're going to try and show to the government, which is what I feel that happens in our current situation, where when you have the same person who is a monitor as well as a controller, it's not in his interest to show what high levels of pollution the country has. So, to sort of come back to your specific question, currently in Delhi, there is supposedly this CPCB and the DPCC, which is the Delhi Pollution Control Authority. These are supposed to be in charge of taking care of air pollution, but they're very under-resourced. They have they're not only do they not have enough staff, even the positions that they have are not fully filled. So they're pretty useless, I would say. There was an ordinance, which is a presidential decree that was passed in November so what happens in Delhi is that between the months of October and December, January, air pollution goes to the roof. Like I mentioned, it goes beyond like 1,000, 1,300. That's when public pressure builds. There are a lot of news items, there's media interest, a lot of pointing and accusations going on. And that's the time when the Supreme Court was planning to set up a single judge commission, which was going to be looking at at crop stubble burning, which during those months actually contributes to almost 40% of North India's pollution in between the months of November and October and November, when the nearby farmlands are burning their crop, and the wind direction has changed. So all that smoke is coming towards Delhi and the most highly urbanized and highly populated areas here. So what happens in this kind of a position is that the government takes band-aid, sort of reactive steps. Public is complaining, let's set this up. Public stops complaining, let's bring it down. So we had this thing called the Commission on Air Quality Management, which was set up by a sorry, by an ordinance. They didn't even take it to parliament. So it was not a parliamentary decree, it was a presidential decree. Quickly and hurriedly set this thing up. And then last week, 2 weeks ago, that ordinance lapsed. So now we have nothing. We have no authority that actually specifically takes care of pollution in the northern part of India. We still have the DPCC, it's the Delhi Pollution Control, and the CPCB, the Central Pollution Control Board, but they continue to plod along like they always were, under-resourced and underfinanced. So nobody is really taking this seriously, and I have questioned time and again in journalistic articles, excuse me, why Swachh Bharat, which is one of the programs of the current government, does not include Swachh Hava. Swachh Bharat means clean India, and clean India without clean air makes no sense to me. You can't start up India made in, I mean, these are all mottos that the current government has, where they're trying to encourage investment, which is a good thing. But hello, how do you make in India and start up in India when you can't even breathe in India? And that's my point, that I think we need to take care of this as a national public health emergency. COVID has actually shown us that the government can, if it wants, it can act boldly, sharply, and take steps, even if they may not be the best steps, but they are quick to act. And the fact that they are not acting on air pollution means that it is still not an issue of electoral. There are actually currently elections are going to be starting in 5 states. And some of the, I'm happy to say that in some of those states like West Bengal, pollution has made it to political manifestos, but in other states, they still have not. So it's taking its time to come up and become an electoral issue. And as the public and as people who try and simplify and amplify credible science around air pollution, I think we cannot let the pressure off. We need to keep talking about it until every corner tea stall, like today, you go to a corner tea stall, you'll have a bunch of unemployed youth talking about how there's corruption in India, there are no jobs. Those people, the day they start talking about how the air in India is polluted and is making all of them sick, that's the day when we're going to see big change in India. There needs to be that tipping point where we all need to be, continuing to put pressure on the government, when the government actually takes, when a particular political party wins on the grounds of air pollution is, I think, when we've arrived. The Aam Aadmi Party, which is Delhi's ruling party, actually is the closest to that. And I have to say they have done a lot in making pollution an electoral issue to some extent, but not enough. I think it needs to become, and again, like I said, India is huge, 32, 33 states, union territory. So it needs to become a national issue in line with unemployment, poverty, and corruption. That's when it's going to really become an electoral issue for parties.
Thank you so much for that, Jyoti. That was amazing. We are at the 10 o'clock hour over here in our time zone. But I did want to say something more general and related to Anaga's questions. And Anaga, like I said, send me an email and we can talk specifically about yours. But the idea that there are a lot of different options in this, and we want students to explore all of those options. And it can be about an industry. It can be about multiple industries that are connected in some way. So you could start looking at the combination of electric vehicles, and then what are the sources of the electricity for those electric vehicles. And there are potential investment strategies that could combine those. And then also the idea of, if you look into, I think the number was 4 companies, what can be provided to help those 4 companies either move forward and become commercialized and viable, or to get them to partner in some way. So there's a lot of, basically, we want you to use your creativity and your education and your youthful exuberance and your unadulterated view of the importance of these issues to be able to provide investment strategies that haven't been thought of before or haven't been implemented and you feel should be. So that's my general statement to answer those questions.
Can I just say one thing? Can I just add one last
Yeah,
thing?
absolutely.
I just want to say that if the young people today are not going to be able to make a difference, whether it's through innovations or through spreading awareness or curriculum, like Arvind's daughter at 11 knows much more about air pollution than, let's say, my parents' generation, who would deny it. So there are a lot of deniers, and fair enough, they weren't aware, science wasn't their thing, they weren't. I think if the young people today don't make that effort to actually find those solutions and action them and look for the money and create that scenario, we're heading very quickly into our own, into it's not even air apocalypse. It's literally like we're heading into our own extinction in a different way, because there are 70,000 research papers, scientific papers, which link health harm from air pollution. And for my generation, we're here maybe what, another 20 years, 30 years, but the young, they have to make sure that they are able to create a future where they could even have children and let them sort of and nurture those children. Otherwise we're dead. I mean, as a race, we're dead. I don't want to make it sound extremely dramatic. It's a fact. The amount of research I did on this book made me realize that I actually, we need to start this work yesterday, and it's only the next generation. That's why I'm so thrilled, and that's why I was quick to say yes to Arvind when he said, will you do this? I'm like, yeah, because I work with young people, and if they're not going to do it, it's not happening. And really, not to just plug the book, but I really want to say this. I mean, I know toolkit is a bad word these days, but I've used there are a lot of resources in this book. And I did mean this book to be a toolkit for people who either don't believe that air pollution causes health harm, or people who are in denial about it, because that's where I started from, and that's where my parents started from, and we've reached the other side of the spectrum. So I really want people to use this book to kind of reach the other side and realize. And there are a whole bunch of resources at the end, which include names of organizations, places that they could volunteer, because I don't think air pollution is a problem that you or I can solve by ourselves. We all have to join hands, corporates, governments, and individuals, to make a difference. We can't do it otherwise. Rich countries have to help poor countries. We have to stop fighting about carbon credits. It's your turn, it's my turn. We got to do it together, because otherwise we're all going to die.